but today we get to listen to Anita Chari share her work. It's a great honor and a delight. Anita Chari is a professor of political science and a faculty fellow in the Clark Honors College at the University of Oregon. A political theorist, somatic practitioner, and writer, her research focuses on the Frankfurt School, Western Marxism, and the relationship between critical theory, contemporary art, and embodied practices. Her recently published book, A User's Manual to Claire Fontaine, which came out with the Lens Press in 2024, has emerged from a decades-long conversation with the feminist conceptual artist whose work provided the theme and the title of the 2024 Venice Biennale, Foreigners Everywhere. Chari's first book, A Political Economy of the Senses, Neoliberalism, Reification, Critique, came out with the Columbia University Press in 2015 and explores the concept of reification in the work of Karl Marx, Georg Lukács, and Theodor Adorno, and the second generation of the Frankfurt School. She is the co-founder of Embodying Your Curriculum, an organization that supports academics, educators, and social justice leaders to bring embodiment practices into higher education. And as a 2025-26 OHC Faculty Research Fellow, Anita Chari is working on a project titled Traumacracy, Towards a Constructive Politics. She shares her work in progress today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Gina, for supporting me in this, in being able to give this talk. It's really a great opportunity to just be able to talk about a work in progress, because this is very much so, and I'm really still finding the kind of story that I'm trying to tell about this work. But as Leah was just saying, the title of this book that I'm working on is Traumacracy. Now it's mobilizing somatic experience towards a constructive politics. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, what this concept of traumacracy is, how I locate it in the heart of contemporary politics. And, I guess I would it's funny hearing, my biography, because I'm like, God, my biography is so, in a way, oddly incoherent. But it will hopefully all make sense, to me at least, by the end of this talk. I'm a political theorist and a scholar of critical theory, but I'm also on the other side. I do a lot of work with embodied practices, and in a lot of ways, this work is an attempt, as my other work is too, but this one probably more so than my other work, is an attempt to bring those two sides of my work and practice together.
Our youngest.
And so.
No, let's just sit here.
So I want to talk about why trauma, right? Why talk about trauma now? I think it's probably clear to most of us that trauma has become kind of a buzzword of our times, right? And in 2020, as the borders closed, as we all went into pandemic quarantines across the globe, this old word gained new traction: trauma, right? Scholars in public health were using this term, in psychology, to talk about COVID-19 and the pandemic as being the great American trauma, at least in the context of the US, and warning about how it would have long-lasting effects on the psyches of the population, right, and exacerbating already existing mental health issues, etc. And it was not only in the field of public health or even in pop culture that people were talking about trauma since the pandemic and in its aftermath. Theorists also, I think of the book, The Third Unconscious, by the social theorist Franco Berardi, who talked about the deprivation of contact during that time of the quarantine as being what he called a long-lasting, low-intensity trauma. Around the same time, Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps Its Score, exploded into kind of mainstream popularity. And that book had been published in 2014 and was of, I would say, somewhat marginal interest at the time. Of course, in psychology and in the somatic world, it had a lot of traction. But in 2020 and 2021, it shot up to the top of the New York Times bestseller list and actually has stayed there to this day, which is interesting. It stayed there for over 7 years. In the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, that year and the protests against anti-Black police violence, there was a lot of discussion around racialized trauma. And the book My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem became a touchstone that was not only cultural but also political. Political scientists also started around that time using the term trauma in reference to the US elections when Donald Trump lost to, when Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden, which is interesting that they were using trauma in this context, they found an association between the election and post-traumatic stress. So, and of course, you could probably say the same in the following election, right? And people were using that term. So when at last in 2021, Oprah published a book on trauma, trauma's status, I think, is the essence of our zeitgeist, was really solidified. And so I think in the face of these kinds of very real and stacked societal upheavals, trauma has become this kind of ubiquitous discourse in the contemporary public sphere. And it's shifted from what was once a kind of marginal term, right? That was used to refer to extreme kind of incidents of psychological injury, harm, historical violence, genocide, to a kind of now unavoidable and very kind of bloated, ubiquitous term for reading contemporary society, right, in its many aspects. And so once trauma was discussed as kind of a departure from the norm, right? Perhaps when we talk about Freud's understanding of trauma, that would be the case. Now daily life itself is seen as traumatic. And so we are all kind of compelled in a way through this lens to read ourselves and society through this idea of what Perul Sebal called the trauma plot in a very influential New Yorker article that came out in 2021. And I think but that being said, this discourse of trauma has become also very much politicized. So it's not something that's just been within the cultural sphere. It's also something that has been adopted, especially I would say by both right and left in different ways, to talk about the crisis of democracy. And I want to talk in more nuanced ways about how people on differing political perspectives, how progressives and how people on the right have been talking about trauma, how those discourses have converged and diverged, and what kind of impact that's had on the kind of, not only the use of the term trauma, but the kind of broader stakes of how we talk about issues around identity politics, around equity, around all of these, around justice and injustice. And really to think differently about the current crisis of democracy. But I do think in a lot of ways that it's not coincidental that trauma has become such a kind of mainstream and resonant discourse at the same time as we have this current phase of authoritarian politics. And part of what I'm trying to inquire into is also that relationship. It's clear in a way why trauma has become a word that people, and a concept that people have used to make sense of their experience, especially in light of this post-2020 condition. But I think the question is what are the broader implications of it, and how has there been kind of a convergence, actually, a bizarre convergence between left and right usages of trauma, and what the implications of those would be. So yeah, amidst this contemporary resonance of trauma, how have we arrived at that critical consensus? And how is that lodged at the core of this, what we might term this current crisis of democracy? Like I said, where do right and left-wing critiques of trauma discourse converge and diverge? But also, and this is important to me, because I'm going to talk, about these different understandings. But in the end, I actually really want to explore what potential remains in trauma discourse to orient a more constructive politics. Because I actually think that there is a lot there to understand, and that can actually help orient a different way of thinking about the contemporary condition of political polarization. I want to think about what this turn towards trauma is symptomatic of, and also, does trauma discourse contain elements that could illuminate practices of care and repair within society, which ultimately for me is kind of what the desire is, what the turn towards trauma is being motivated by, at least I would say by those who are adopting it in progressive ways, right, rather than in perhaps cynical cynical or what I'm thinking of as more kind of weaponized ways, right? But even differentiating those things is a difficult task. So those are the questions I want to think about. So I want to situate this within, first of all, just thinking about trauma as it's been studied, right, in terms of trauma studies. So just to, I can't go into the whole history, right, but if we just, to give a brief history, right, and think about the modern study of trauma, right, and it began in, let's say, roughly the late 1860s with John Erickson, who was a British physician who was studying people who had had railway accidents and thinking about trauma in that context. And so these early approaches to trauma, developed by people like him, as well as neurologists Paul Oppenheim and Pavlov, were focusing very much on the physiological dimensions of trauma and its effects. And then by the turn of the century, the works of Charcot, Pierre Janet, Joseph Breuer, who worked with Freud, of course, and Freud himself, they began to explore the psychological and emotional dimensions of trauma and shock, of sudden and unexpected experiences of shock. And so these later figures, shifted the focus of trauma from the body to the mind, from soma to psyche. Even though I would say for Freud, certainly the body is still absolutely central. So Freud's early work with Joseph Breuer, Studies in Hysteria, was thinking very much about this idea of hysterical illness as a very feminized condition. And the way he thought about it in a way that no longer really holds much traction is that he wanted to think about hysterical illness as a response to repressed sexual desire, often stemming from experiences, as later feminists discussed, of sexual trauma, especially in women. And so this feminine focus persisted from early psychoanalysis through subsequent decades until then, and it's surprising actually because the shell shock of soldiers was actually one of the major phenomenon symptoms that motivated a lot of the study of trauma, actually the early study of trauma. And even Freud, he actually wrote early essays first that were examining trauma in soldiers and men primarily, yet the whole history of trauma has kind of been refigured as this kind of history of the hysterical illness of women. But that is another story. But I think, just to say, it's interesting to me the kind of switch back between focusing on the body, focusing on the more psychological dimensions, and then back again, as we see then in later studies of trauma. So then after the First World War, people really weren't looking that much about trauma, weren't looking at it that much until then the Vietnam War, when then the US psychiatric community became much more interested in trauma and the damage wrought upon veterans by war. Yeah. And then the DSM included PTSD as a syndrome only in 1980, actually, and that was in response to a lot of political organizing on the part of veterans, and as well as feminist organizing on behalf of survivors of sexual violence. And so then trauma studies arises as an academic discipline in the 90s, especially in the field of literary studies. And I think the concerns there are especially focused on how trauma functions in relation to representation and language, and is very much influenced by Freudian conceptualizations of trauma. But then, roughly at this same period, you have this kind of development of somatically oriented psychotherapists, such as Bessel van der Kolk, whose work then exploded into popularity in the mainstream, and also Peter Levine, who steered the study of trauma towards the body and the nervous system, and emphasizing the ways in which experiences that provoke trauma, whether they're acute or chronic, how they leave their imprint on the nervous system, right, and somatic experience. And so a focus on bodily sensation becomes really important to those practitioners. And then I would say in the last decade, for sure, there's been much more of a turn towards a kind of politicized approach to trauma and a somatically oriented approach towards trauma. And so theorists or practitioners like Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, would fit into that category. He's interesting because he's a practitioner, he's a somatic psychotherapist, but then he also does work with in the public sphere, working with like cops, working with people who have trauma in a more politicized vein. Stacey K. Haynes' Politics of Trauma is another example of that kind of more politicized approach. And David Treleaven also that has moved the conversation in mindfulness also towards issues of like the structural and kind of practical turn of somatic trauma practice. So that's just to kind of situate that conversation, because I am interested in, I've been interested in how trauma studies has looked at this problem, and also how it can be useful or less useful for understanding what's going on with the use of trauma discourse today. And so in that vein, I was thinking really about how scholars in trauma studies have approached some of the central problems of trauma. And one of the books that I think has been most influential, even though it was published in 2020, is Ruth Lays' Trauma, A Genealogy. And this was a book that was a really comprehensive genealogy of the kind of tensions that run through trauma studies, trauma practice from its inception, its deep inception till the present. And so I think even though it was written in 2000, it's a very relevant book for what's going on today. But I think it's also relevant as a kind of cautionary tale in terms of the kind of understanding what the focus of academic trauma studies has been, and how in some ways it's inadequate to thinking about some of these contemporary political problems. So just to speak about what Lays does in this book, she really is focused on tracing a kind of tension in the treatment and study of trauma between what she calls, on the one hand, mimetic models of trauma, and on the other hand, anti-mimetic models of trauma, which is, a very, it doesn't really tell you what she means just by those terms. But mimetic models, and they run through all different theories. So Freud, for example, has both anti-mimetic and mimetic tendencies in his work. But mimetic refers to the idea that, in a way, trauma results in a kind of absence of the subject from themselves in the act of trauma. And so in that sense, a victim of trauma is immersed in the traumatic experience so deeply that they're unable to take any kind of reflective distance from it. That would be necessary to be able to have cognitive knowledge of the traumatic event. And so what's troubling to Lays about the mimetic model, which is based in many ways upon some early models within Freud, for example, that are based upon hypnosis. A lot of, if you read studies in hysteria, for example, it's kind of bizarre and funny, because like Freud is like touching the head, but not like a somatic therapist or something. Like he's like touching the head of his patients, right, of his clients, and having them do free association in that way. There's this whole dimension of hypnosis that runs through it. And so for Lays, part of the problem of this is that it results in a kind of inherent unreliability of the testimony of victims of trauma, and thus leads to this problem of how can we have accurate knowledge of traumatic events, basically. So that's mimetic. On the other hand, anti-mimetic models are kind of more these like neurobiological models. And Bessel van der Kolk, for her, is like the main target here. And in a way, her book is directed very much against anti-mimetic models more than anything else. And so the anti-mimetic model kind of conceives of trauma as a kind of passive experience, such that it's fundamentally biological, bodily, and the victim of trauma is understood to be a spectator who can later, perhaps with the support of a practitioner, recover the imprinted experiences of trauma and perhaps then heal from them. So the subject is kind of seen as victimized by a form of violence that is purely an assault from the outside. And speaking generally, right, about all any form of trauma, right? And the problem for Lays, and I think this is crucial. The problem for Lays with this kind of model is that it relies on an unmediated understanding of traumatic events. It grasps them as a kind of literal etching upon the nervous system, and thus leads to the kind of unrepresentability of traumatic events. And so then you have other scholars within the field of trauma studies, for example, Kathy Carruth, who then are committed to a kind of idea that trauma is unrepresentable, right? And that, and just to use a quote from Lays here, Lays finds this immensely problematic because it leads to a completely unmediated understanding of the event and thus reifies it, essentializes that event. So according to Lays, Carruth is committed to the widespread post-Holocaust assumption according to which any attempt to represent trauma is distortive. So we can't represent it. Any representation would be distortive. So, I don't want to spend much more time talking about Lays except to say that what I see in her work, as well as in a lot of academic trauma studies, is a huge emphasis and almost sole emphasis on questions of epistemology. The question of how do we know the events? How do we know if the victim has reliable testimony? How all of these kinds of questions, which obviously are important questions. So I'm not saying that they aren't. What I am saying, and what I will say, as I go on, is that I think that there are some problems with the emphasis on epistemology, and B, the kind of deprioritizing and the kind of conflation of bodily experience with an unmediated understanding of trauma. The idea that if we were to think about bodily experience in relation to trauma, that it will always just be kind of unmediated and therefore not very useful for political discussions, right? In fact, detrimental to political discussions. So, this is basically what I just said, but I think the point being that, and I'll talk about this as I go on, but I actually think that it's, these kinds of critiques actually overlook a lot of the recent innovations in somatic theory and practice. Especially these kinds of more politicized somatic approaches to trauma, which want to think more about the societal dimensions of trauma, but integrate them with bodily experience. And I actually will want to argue that this is going to be central to any kind of productive use of trauma discourse, that having a grasp of how the role that embodied experience plays in it is really going to be important. And much trauma studies, because of its emphasis on these kind of epistemological issues, cannot do that. So the other problem I think that comes up in trauma studies is like the idea, and I think the idea that it's just concept creep. That's a term that I think he's a psychologist, Nick Haslam, talked about in relation to trauma. Concept creep meaning we're just using the word trauma for everything, right? And in fact, when I try to present this project, it's like, well, what do you mean by trauma? It's like, well, it doesn't really, I'm trying to delineate that there's a range of ways that people are using the word trauma, right? And I think, some of these critiques would say like, well, we're just applying the word trauma to everything and therefore it's completely useless, right? But this isn't really what I think is the central problem here, because I think this overlooks what trauma and the turn towards trauma really is a symptom of. So here I turn to this quote from Anne Svetkovich, who's an anthropologist who wrote a book, who writes a lot about trauma, but wrote an archive of feelings, trauma, sexuality, and lesbian public cultures. And she actually advocates for the generalization of trauma, to understand it as a broader cultural phenomenon. So she says, I would like to advocate for the value of concepts of trauma that emerge from a wide range of social contexts. The resulting domain of investigation need not consist of feelings that are making a presumptuous claim to count as trauma, but instead comprises an emotional field around trauma that requires as much attention as that which normally fits the definition. And so that's more how I'm approaching it, rather than, I think, with the kind of more paranoid reading of the trauma studies that is like, well, can we legitimately use the word trauma here? I'm actually trying to understand what is it a symptom of, and how is the way that it's being used in these different contexts significant? So now I want to talk a little bit about how trauma discourse has appeared in kind of contemporary politics, because this is really this is very much work in progress. I'm really thinking about this right now, but I've been interested in what I see as a bizarre convergence between left and right discussions of trauma in a way. And so let me try to talk a little bit about what I'm seeing. I have some political scientists in the room to help me with this. But so trauma talk on the right, let's start there. There's been a lot of conflation of, I mean, first of all, it kind of outrages me to read a lot of this stuff, I have to say. And yet I'm like, I need to think about what its significance is. And so some of these words, while they don't actually use the word trauma, there's been kind of a constellation of terms that have been circling around trauma discourse. Safetyism, for example, which is a term that's being used to talk about the kind of, especially in terms of campus culture, academic culture, and a lot of this does really hinge upon things that are happening in universities right now, I think, free speech debates in universities. But safetyism being the idea that an emphasis on kind of an excessive emphasis on not offending anyone, right? And that being the kind of basis of creating safety in terms of speech. Chris Rufo recently wrote this article, and it's very interesting how the right is really coming out in the open with a lot of these arguments to talk about the need to rewrite the rules of cancel culture. So up till now, it's been like the right saying, let's cancel culture, right? Cancel culture has been seen as something that's allied with the negative politics of trauma that they are opposing. Now it's this kind of rewriting the rules of cancel culture, embracing it in a way, which is interesting. Snowflake, that's something we've heard a lot, right? Which is the idea of the kind of progressive fragility that can't, kind of is too traumatized to be able to handle, too weak to be able to handle dissensual speech. I think this all came out very much in in all of the debates and discussions around the protests around Gaza, right, in the encampments. And I think that is going to be an important case study for what I'm thinking about, which I've only begun now to really dive into. But I think a lot of the arguments in response to Gaza protests, on both left and right, but let's just start with the right, we're talking about how a hostile environment was created, right? So on the right, it's a hostile environment was created for Jewish students, for example. In the wake of having encampments in campus space. So the idea of a hostile environment meaning people don't feel safe, right? People don't feel safe, and that is somehow in a way related to the idea of trauma, right? People were actually using the term. This is re-traumatizing us in relation to our historical intergenerational trauma, right? Trump derangement syndrome became a term used after 2016. Those who were concerned about impending fascism, then, the idea of Trump derangement syndrome came about. And this, reading some of these conservative commentators is interesting. So Heather McDonald is someone who's been writing about this, and she directly relates these issues to like the discussions about hysteria, right? So this is interesting. Victorian neurasthenia has been reborn on campuses today as alleged trauma inflicted by such monuments of Western literature as Ovid's Metamorphosis. Right? And we see an explosion of kind of like conservative affirmative action attempts on campuses. I mean, yeah. So it's something this is all situated, I think, within these debates about trauma. As is the idea of the great feminization of the American university, which is also another one from Heather McDonald, where trauma and the kind of desire to create safe spaces has been also allied with a kind of idea of feminization, the idea of empathy that comes along with a lot of desires to promote safe space, for example, has been criticized in this way. And she talks about I'll talk about that in terms of the left wing, but she was talking about the kind of campus culture and of even university presidents who are using these kinds of discourses of trauma. For example, the NYU not new, she's been around for like at least a year, the NYU president currently, who's actually a social worker and scholar of trauma. So, and of course then we've heard this one from Russell Vaught, we want the bureaucrats to be traumatically affected, right? The deployment of trauma as a kind of deliberate political strategy. So that's just some constellations of things that I've seen that have been attached to discourses of trauma. Then, and I think these have been in many ways about weaponizing certain concepts that, have come have come out of progressive discourses in a way. So with Vaught and the idea of trauma as a political strategy in itself, it is also kind of a reprise of this idea maybe that we had in the early 2000s of the shock doctrine of Naomi Klein, of like this deployment of traumatic overwhelm as a way of flooding society with these kinds of anti-democratic measures that no one can keep track of, and that to acknowledge that as a deliberate strategy. Now, that's interesting to me also because when I think about the definition of trauma that many trauma theorists use, but just to use one, Resmaa Menakem's idea of trauma, and I think this actually comes from Peter Levine, the idea that what is trauma? Trauma is anything that's too much, too fast, or too soon for the consciousness, the nervous system to actually digest, metabolize, process. Well, of course it is, right? But that's the design, that's the strategy. So there's that, but then of course on the left, there's a whole other set of constellations, some of which overlap with the way that the right is talking about it. And I think a lot of this comes out of efforts towards inclusion, equity, diversity that we've seen that gained traction over the last 20 years and that have now totally been rolled back or are trying to be rolled back. So we have terms like microaggressions and trigger warnings, right? Which is a common kind of practice that's come along with kind of trauma-informed pedagogy, which is something I'll talk about more. Deplatforming, which is something that, the idea that people with hateful beliefs that are actually causing potential violence shouldn't be able to have access to certain platforms. That's part of what then has been called cancel culture. White fragility, which is, in a way, another term that is making this idea of fragility, right? It's funny, even talking about this is like, it's difficult. And I think the reference to safe spaces and what safe spaces are they possible? So in terms of DEI discourse, Ibram Kendi's idea, which was very controversial actually, but was adopted by many universities. There's no in-between safe space of not racism, right? Not being racist. We have the idea of the anxious generation from Jonathan Haidt, which is the idea that there's this whole generation, Generation Z, grown up around technology that in a way, and he doesn't use the word trauma in this, but the idea that there's a constant overwhelm and inability to process the kind of overstimulation because of being because of this experience of having grown up with too much technology and with a sociality that's totally mediated by technology. Hostile environment is one that I see both on the left and the right? But the idea that, and I think this was certainly true of the idea that certain speakers shouldn't be able to speak on campus, right? Which is obviously a huge issue right now in the wake of Charlie Kirk. The hostile environment standard being something that then was turned against protesters in the wake of the Gaza protests. So, and safe spaces is another one. And then I think, just the general use of trauma. So Linda Mills is the NYU president, right? We're a community that's hurting due to the traumatic effects of the pandemic. So trauma is, it's being used. So I came up with this term traumacracy to really describe the ways in which these discourses of trauma are being mobilized in the public sphere in relation to questions about democracy. And the ways in which this constellation, the way in which trauma serves as both a means for legitimating the erosion of democracy and for producing it, for affecting it, as in the case of Vaught, right? We want to put the bureaucrats in trauma. So this is kind of what I'm trying to grapple with, is how these discourses come together. And I want to think about this then in terms of, because I think there's a growing awareness that we have a problem, certainly in terms of progressive discourses and how, I want to talk about this a little more later because I see this as kind of like a Foucauldian moment of where we're seeing certain discourses that are being borrowed from the left and turned against. But I think the idea also of what's going on with the discourse of identity politics is also part of this. And so the scholar Olufemi Taiwo wrote a book that was called Elite Capture, which really discusses this problem in detail. I want to talk a little bit about him. But I want to talk about that in the context of the way in which trauma discourse is being used to question subjects' capacities for democratic agency. So university administrators, in 2024, were targeting student protests and encampments in a way by saying that, on the one hand, we have Gen Z, who's fragile. On the other hand, Gen Z is also engaging in speech that's seen as potentially violent, right? Simultaneously enfeebled by their trauma and thus in need of protection, as well as the agent of illiberal and hostile speech. So that's interesting to me. And I think it was the basis on which protesters could be seen as operating outside of norms that would protect free speech. And they were therefore subject to the use of force. And so I think we need to think carefully about how that operation works, both enfeebled, both traumatized, right, and in some way violent. And all of this I think is taking place within the context of these questions about that people on the left are having around how protest is becoming delegitimized right now in accelerated and very dangerous ways. So this article by Alex Gurovich, "The Right to be Hostile," I think is makes a really important intervention at this point. And it makes a crucial intervention, I think, because it also does a lot of self-critical work on the part of how these discourses on the left have also played into the way in which the right is mobilizing trauma politics. And what he says, and I think this is crucial, he says, "A democratic society generally, and colleges and universities in particular, must protect the right to engage in public disruptive acts, including those that feature open expressions of hostility to political views, even at the cost of some people feeling discomfort or even intense unease." That was the prevailing attitude towards protest on campus for the past several decades, post-1960s, and it served all students as well as the mission and vitality of the university well. But the key here in terms of trauma politics would be this idea of at the cost of some people feeling discomfort or even intense unease, because this is the slippage that has happened in terms of trauma, that trauma would be something that causes discomfort is somehow traumatic or traumatizing, right? And that is a problem. That is a slippage that is really not working well. So, as he says, any norm that takes mere feelings of fear or discomfort as grounds for repression makes protest impossible. So you have to be very cautious about that slippage. And I think we need to also locate this in the context of what Olufemi Taiwo has called elite capture, which is the ways in which these kind of discourses around marginalization and oppression, the desire to center the voices of those who are most marginalized, has also been taken up and captured, has been used for political capital on behalf of what he says is elites, right? That in a way this isn't really serving those who actually are the ones who experience that oppression often, right? Centering the most marginalized, in my experience, has usually meant handing conversational authority to whoever is already in the room and appears to fit a social category associated with some form of oppression. So the idea that we need to resist the ways in which trauma politics are being conscripted towards this kind of form of political capital in a way. So, I think also this harks back to debates that were happening, quite a while ago in the 90s. For me, Wendy Brown's, she's a feminist political theorist, Wendy Brown's book, States of Injury, I think is a crucial source for this, where, she talks about the kind of politics of injury and how it gets lodged into the heart of identity politics, and how can we be more self-critical about that confluence. And Nick Estes, in relation to indigenous politics, talks about this as well, right? What are the costs of, this trauma politics, right? The cunning of trauma politics is that it turns actual peoples and struggles, whether racial or indigenous citizenship and belonging, into matters of injury. And how do we begin to resist that? What are the implications of that? Time goes quickly. So, okay, I'm gonna move past that. But, so this is something I'm really just beginning to think about, but I do think there's not enough discussion then on the left of the ways in which progressive discourses of the trauma-informed turn have been playing into this constellation. And if we talked about it more, how would this recognition shift our current strategies and discourses is something I'm interested in thinking about. And I'm also interested in so right now the work I'm doing is kind of mining more deeply into how this is happening. And, a kind of touchstone for me has been Foucault's work on punishment and the kind of argument that he's making in Discipline and Punish about the late 18th century reformers and how their critiques of torture and sovereign power actually paved the way for the entrenchment of incarceration and new forms of disciplinary domination, which, in his view were not actually, were not in any obvious sense something we could say were less oppressive, right? Even though, that's an argument that bears a lot more analysis. But I think the point I want to try to dive into is about this kind of way in which these liberal reformist discourses were actually then taken up and made the kind of basis for the entrenchment of new forms of oppression. What does it mean that we're situated in a moment in which that's happening and certain things are becoming unsayable, and how do we navigate that context? So I guess let me just for now summarize what I think some of this means in terms of how we would approach the politics of trauma, the use of trauma discourse. I think that one of the major problems here with the way that trauma is being used is that trauma theory and practice cannot substitute for a theory of domination or political violence. But that's ultimately what it's often being asked to do. And, to my mind, someone like Taiwo, for example, I think would say, we just need to stop doing this thing with trauma. Like, this is not really relevant to our politics. And I would say I wouldn't fully agree with that. I would say not in that way, right? But I think we have to look more deeply at what is trauma discourse pointing us towards, right? And to my mind, as I'll talk about in a minute, what it's pointing us towards is a kind of sense that we need practices to rebuild our kind of intersubjective relationships, and that this does need to be at the heart of what we think about when we think about democratic practices. I'll talk about this a little bit later in the relationship to what Wendy Brown has called reparative democracy. Like, if we really want to have something like reparative democracy, I do believe that we have to attend to what is broken in our intersubjectivity, right? What in us, at a bodily level, is not allowing us to listen to one another. I do think that that's part of the story. I do think the desire to talk about trauma is symptomatic of a ton of social crises and a sense of immense precarity, right? And that can't just be, that isn't just going to go away just because we decide not to talk about trauma. But I do think that trauma can't be asked to substitute for a theory of political violence. It simply doesn't do that, right? When we get into these conversations of, on the one hand, people on the left claiming a certain form of oppression or trauma, and then you have on the right, then, well, what about the trauma of police officers? What about the trauma of wounded white working class men, right? I mean, this is the conversation that we're having. It's always a question, and of course, I'm going to give an example of how I think about that. How can we think about that productively? Because the claim towards trauma doesn't say anything about the question of political domination or violence. So the second point the point I want to make really is this point about the politics of repair and care. And I think also the point being that we also need to have practices for politicizing discourses around fear, safety, and survival. Because this is really at the heart of what's going on here, right? On all around us, right? Ultimately, it comes down to the fact that survival and fear have to be talked about in political terms rather than simply being claimed in apolitical terms. That's at the heart of a lot of the most intractable issues we face right now, including all of the discourses about crime and police violence that we're looking at. So we have to be able to talk about and work with fear and survival in a different way. And I think ultimately trauma discourse could, if we focus it not on these questions of epistemology, not in the way that it's being used in terms of substituting for a theory of political violence, but rather as a kind of set of practices that can actually orient us towards shifting perception, reorienting intersubjectivity, having really productive conversations across divides of experience, we can actually find a different use for it that actually responds to what it is a symptom of, rather than a discourse that just mobilizes woundedness and creates political capital out of a politics of injury. I think finally we need to pay particular attention to the way in which the neoliberal figuration of the subject as not just an entrepreneur but as a client and consumer feeds into this notion. And this is to be worked on more. But I do think in terms of the universities and the way that we think about students, this is a key issue. Both client-consumer and, that is simultaneously too traumatized to engage in politics and someone we need to attend to in this clientelistic way. So I want to, this is not enough time. Okay. Let me just quickly say, because, let me say a little bit about why I come to this question, because I think that's an important part of the story, right? Which is and that's the trauma plot, right? This is the moment for the backstory, which Parul Sehgal talks about in a fairly disparaging way. Why do we always have to have backstory in contemporary literature? I actually like autofiction, and I'm totally cool with the backstory, but so I want to say a little about my backstory, which is why do I come to the study of trauma, because I don't actually come to it as a kind of removed commentator who's just like, oh, trauma seems to be important in our politics. I really come to it because I myself, over 20 years ago really came to embodiment as something that I felt was crucial for thinking not only about politics but about my own life, and also for being able to be a scholar in the way that I wanted to participate in academic knowledge production in the way that I wanted to. And so for me, embodiment became a central piece of my pedagogy. It became central also to my scholarship. And from there, for me, it wasn't really about trauma as such, but I think a lot of work within the world of somatics and embodiment naturally tends towards questions about trauma, because there is a question of just the sense of having to reckon with the questions of violence and our histories that every person has to reckon with, right? And that's both a personal question and a political question. And so for me, in the aftermath of the pandemic, I had already been doing all this work with somatics, embodied pedagogies, and I have a very close collaborator and mentor of mine who is a somatic trauma therapist. And in the aftermath of 2020, we came together and really responded to the fact that there was an outpouring of need and articulated desire for learning about how do we deal with this. We're in a societal crisis. And people were talking about it in terms of trauma. And so I also talked about it in terms of trauma. Trauma-informed pedagogy is like a center of a lot of the things that I do. I'm fine with that, although at the time I also felt very cautious about the potential biopoliticization of the idea of trauma. What happens then when universities are like, yeah, let's adopt trauma-informed pedagogies, right? It was a very edgy place for me, and yet I knew the importance of the work. I developed a lot of that work while doing work in the context of incarceration, where I was doing, over the last 20 years I've been working with incarcerated folks, and here at the UVO for the last 13 years. And so teaching in that context for me was a very clear case of where trauma-informed pedagogies, embodied pedagogies that really recognize the fact that this is a very violent space, not because of the people in it, but because of the structural violence of the space and the sense that what does safety even mean in a prison, right? What does it mean to try to have conversations, especially with a group of students that are both students from campus and students from the prison, right? So to me, it was very clear that this is where this work can really matter. And indeed, I had so many experiences with students who, some of my inside students, I can say, hold a more wide array of political beliefs than in here, in the sense that, I had a student, for example, in this past year who, and he gave me permission to share this story, but he's a Trump supporter. He had a lot of skepticism about the course. We were reading like women of color feminisms, think Malcolm X, the stuff that could had in the past, and for him as well, was triggering, where he felt, oh, I don't think I'm going to be able to say what I actually believe in this class. And we talked about it. We do a lot of somatic practices. We do a lot of things, and interestingly, and it's not like I'm trying to claim this as some magical thing, but I will say often systematically there's an ability by the end of the course to be able to actually have conversations across those divides, right? Not that, okay, all of a sudden there's an agreement or anything, but I think there's a sense of what is the collateral damage also of certain systems of domination is something that comes to be recognized. There's an ability to say, well, this is what I believe and this is why I believe it, let's talk about it. And he felt included in the space. And that story is a deeper story, but I will say that for me, it's actually through practice that I've understood that there's real significance to the work that can be done with embodied practices. Whether we call them trauma or not is, to me, immaterial, and probably it's better not to in this phase, given the uses that trauma has been put to. But the point is about really what I call, a different model of identity, right? And so in this book, I'm conceptualizing what I call a model of metabolic identity, which is the idea that it's not about constituting identity around trauma or injury. It's really about the question of how do you create the conditions for people to actually process their experience in intersubjective capacities and relationships and conversations. And so, practices of contact, sensate awareness, relational practices, I think, are really crucial for that. And they're not just individual practices, they're really practices that work on a collective level. And so to me, to speak of the idea of constructive politics, which is an idea that Taiwo talks about, but which I'm very much interested in, right? What does that mean? I think that engaging that level, rather than simply disregarding the problem to which trauma politics responds, is really the way forward, so that we can kind of empower these forms of perception that are necessary to have any kind of conversation right now. Think about democracy, right? So when Wendy Brown talks about reparative democracy, I'm very much in favor of that, and yet I think we need to have much more immersion, especially as political theorists, I would say, with the actual practices that underlie the possibility of reparative democracy. So with that, I will thank you.
That many people have to go, myself among them, but would you be willing, maybe if people could raise their hands, would you be willing to take some questions, and then maybe at like 1:05 or 1:10 we should, I won't be here to moderate, so maybe we can just make sure that we let Anita relax after her great presentation. So let's keep it brief but pithy, and thank you for sharing your work.
Thank you so much.
If it's okay. So first off, thank you. I'm totally blown away by the pieces of this puzzle you're putting together. I'd be curious, so as you were talking, I was thinking of the relation of trauma and democracy, and you gesture towards care and repair being an important part. So as I was listening, and it came up more in the latter part of your talk, where I get a sense that care and repair comes through a particular pedagogy that you bring for a type of intersubjective sharing that is possible. But I guess more than anything, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Is pedagogy as such, that is care and repair as a pedagogical initiative, not somehow anti-democratic? And how you would level the relationship between what is essentially the imperative of a classroom as a non-democratic space with a vision of democracy that's predicated on care and repair?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a crucial question. I mean, it's interesting because I think in a way, I almost believe that care and repair is also a means towards which we can have real agonism. which is to say, I don't in this idea of care and repair think that somehow, because I agree with the idea that democracy isn't about coming to agreement in that sense, right? I mean, for me, it's a question of, if we think of in terms of like Laclau and Mouffe's understanding of like antagonism versus agonism. I think antagonism is a kind of unbreachable divide almost of discourse in which you're not really in the same conversational space, discursive space. And the shift of antagonism to agonism, I think it's the question of how do we actually get there. So care and repair, I don't know, as a pedagogical project is certainly how I've used it, right? And no, I don't think that it's anti-democratic in an educational space, in the sense that I also have care. I have care for those who fundamentally disagree with what I think. I mean, care to me is not something that's predicated on some kind of vision of homogeneity or of agreement or unanimity at all. And I think if it did, it would be a problem. And I think part of the biopolitical use of trauma practice is that it treats care and repair as a kind of infantilizing, paternalistic project. But I don't think it should be done that way, and I think there are important ways in which we can offer correctives for that. But I do think it's like it can be a condition for shifting to the capacity for agonism, which I think is what we want. And I don't think it's really fully what we have right now. I think what we have is antagonism. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Really fantastic project. I'm really excited about it. I mean, I think you in the second half of the presentation, in the second half of it seems what you're working on, you talk a little bit more about how trauma appears within groups, within political movements. But one of the things that I was thinking about while you were talking is that one of the ways I've seen it pop up in political spaces is trauma as trauma sharing, and in particularly kind of a sort of testimony, kind of confessional way, right? And I think on the right, sometimes this appears in religious communities especially, so evangelical spaces where it's combined with an evangelical tradition of testifying, of confession. In left-wing spaces, I think sometimes it pops up in actually similar ways, just given different phrasing. But this idea of that part of your ability to be admitted into a collective political space is that you have to share trauma, and you have to go through this kind of confessional process, right, of sharing your trauma, sharing your backstory, and that is the basis of political membership to a political community or a collective. And I was wondering if you have thoughts on that or how that factors into your analysis.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Rucker. I mean, I think that's very interesting, the connection you made between like the kind of religious, like evangelical version of the confession, and then, that also there's this version of it on the progressive side or on the left. And it makes me think also of like the Foucauldian like pastoral kind of notion of power, but to me that's exactly what I think Taiwo is criticizing, rightly, in the sense that like the price of admission is a trauma story, right? And I think for me, I think a certain level of sharing can occur in that, but I don't necessarily think working with trauma, for example, if we think about trauma-informed practices, that they always involve a kind of constellation around a narrative even. Because and that's why working with the body is interesting to me, because it's like, it's not anti-discursive, but it doesn't necessarily always need to be about the trauma plot, you know what I mean? It can be more about questions about how do we negotiate space in the present moment, or how do we understand the very current dynamics of power and relationality in the space that we're in, And of course, I think it has to have limits, because it's not really the substance of political discourse, it's more about the conditions, right? I think about it as kind of I think of it as kind of like infra-politics, like the sort of, kind of condition that allows for certain kinds of conversations to happen. Potentially, it can. So I don't know if that responds, but I think I have to think more about the conventional mode.
Thanks. I'm sort of building off that. It would be really. So I'm curious about, and maybe this is in the epistemology stuff, but the importance or relationship or the existence where it is of sincerity. Seems like sincerity is pretty important to that anxiety that you mentioned earlier about the truthiness of what is being related, right? Of the person who's experienced it. Whereas I guess I wonder about sincerity given the political usages of the things on the right in that slide, that most of those calls of snowflakes are in bad faith, it seemed to me. And so sincerity occupies a very different, I think, valence in that kind of claim of whether you're a snowflake or even Chris Rufo's stuff, who's super dedicated and tries to be rigorous about this stuff.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about the role of, or the importance of sincerity.
Yeah, no, I think this is a crucial question because, yeah, I think about this too, because it's like, could I distinguish on the one hand between just sincere uses of, since the sincere deployment of trauma stories or trauma, and on the other hand, the kind of, what I see is like kind of a weaponization, which is not sincere, right? It's like, I could use this. It's like, that's trauma as political capital in a lot of ways, right? Like, I can use this part of my story to make certain claims, you know what I mean? And I think that is a difficult thing, right? It comes up in these questions around the kind of trauma Olympics of it all, right? In the sense that when for example, in my class, right, we would read Malcolm X, and Malcolm X talks about like the white devil burning down his house. And so there was a lot of conversation about this in my class, where it was like there were white students, incarcerated students especially, who were like, this is racist, this is horrible, like I don't want to read this is like traumatic for me, right? Because I'm actually experiencing domination. And so I don't know if this is the same point, because they were being sincere. They were being totally sincere. And in fact, my role there was not to doubt their sincerity or to try to call it into question, so much as it's to try to bring the possibility of another perspective, right? That, oh, how do these two perspectives actually coexist, right? So I think the problem is, and this makes me think of Judith Butler's recent work on kind of like the kind of sadistic character of contemporary authoritarianism, which, they talk about how, in a way, we can't really even talk about sincerity or truth claims in relation to this, because it simply strengthens the kind of sadistic character of what's happening, right, with the Trump administration. And to me, there's a kind of need to have analytical levels, I guess, of, okay, so if we're talking about an intersubjective like process in a collective situation, like we have to then assume that sincerity is at play. But I think there's something else going on if we're talking about, I'm like analyzing political discourse, then I'm not sure how I approach sincerity. Do you know what I mean? But I think this is a crucial question, right? I think it's what a lot of us are thinking about when we think about trauma, right? Well, is this real? If we can't think about it in terms of legitimacy, then all we really have is something like sincerity. And to me, I have to just take that, right? Like, you're being sincere, what kind of conversation can we have? I don't know if that speaks to the point, but yeah, thank you.
So when you were speaking about sort of the backstory, I just find that so interesting, all these somatic experiences. And I remember that the time I was discussing with a friend, and he said, like, it seems that you experience disagreement physically. And I do, particularly sort of this political disagreement, like it feels so unpleasant. And when someone agrees with me, it feels very pleasant. What is known about our actual physical sensations of disagreement and agreement?
Yeah, well, I think this is so important, right? Because it also comes back to the question of discomfort, right? And the question of, I think in general, that's a shared experience, right? In the sense of often, if we're in a conversation, if I'm in a conversation with somebody who's like, has very opposing beliefs about the current political situation, like, I may well experience that as almost like activating in my body. I say activating rather than triggering, because I think triggering is like not a useful word. It's always pathologizing. It's always kind of a negative thing. Whereas I think like in the somatic world, we talk about activation as kind of like, oh, that's deeply uncomfortable because it's actually touching on something relevant, sincerely relevant to my understanding of myself, my history, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I do think that, like, that's relevant information, right? Because part of it, and Resmaa Menakem talks a lot about this in terms of how you work with kind of issues of like race, for example. And he speaks directly about what happens, for example, with police officers, which is an extreme example of what happens to them when they have a trauma response. So, Resmaa Menakem is African American, and he's very much about getting to the bottom of that issue. But he's saying, like, at the bottom of this, there is a thing of somatic experience that we have to consider, right? But the point is not to avoid that experience, but to stretch open the capacity for being in discomfort.
Yeah.
But all of this is also very difficult when we think about the other part of this, which is that when we think about impending authoritarianism, we think that's real danger. That's not just a trauma response, or there's a question of when one really needs to act.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's not a question I have an answer to.
Yeah.
But I do think paying attention to bodily experience helps us to have a different relationship to that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thanks for that.
Well, since we're in an academic setting and you mentioned the concept of discomfort, I wish to suggest that that's one of the purposes of an academic setting. And it was 55, maybe 60 years ago when I was an undergraduate, a certain student in a political science class, by the way, suggested during conversation about something which then was old hat, which was the relationships between Israel and Palestine. And she happened to be Jewish, so she went to the dean of students and she said, I wish to lodge a complaint against the professor in this class because he made me feel unsafe and uncomfortable. And the dean of students said, good, that's his job. If he did not physically assault you or single you out in person and you felt uncomfortable and unsafe, then I would have to commend him rather than castigate him, because that is his function. It's to get you off your comfort zone and to think critically about what makes you feel uncomfortable and why. So there was another part of your presentation which caught my attention, and that was the mention of Freud, because Freud is really the originator of this concept. Trauma, it's Traum, it comes from the German dream, and one of his seminal works was, of course, the interpretation of dreams, which is a very useful and elastic concept because, as you pointed out, it can mean just about anything. And so that's why it makes it a useful academic concept, because people can say, I'm talking about trauma, and person two can say, I'm talking about trauma, and they may have very little point of disagreement because they have a particular understanding of trauma. And I think what we have done is take this idea of the dream and turn it into what the Germans call an Albtraum, which is, of course, an outdream, which is a nightmare. So when we talk about trauma, we don't talk about dreams, which are elusive and sometimes useful and sometimes not. We talk about nightmares, which are pretty much the same. And whether it has any real world application or not is, I guess, as your paper suggests, an ongoing subject of debate. How useful can it be, and in what ways can it be useful?
Yeah, and thank you for that. To your first point, I fully agree. I fully agree with the idea that education should be about, in many ways, making us feel discomfort, right? And I think that's something, we're struggling to have to re-own now, because I think most of us agree with that, and yet we're laboring under centuries of particular paradigms of education that have also been exclusive. And so, you know, the point being that inclusion isn't about eliminating discomfort, right? And how do we hold those two goals together, right? I think part of the problem that we're seeing, and that's with the Gorovitch article, I think, you know, the right to be hostile is very important, because what we're seeing is that if we eliminate speech that we think is unsafe to us, we will have that surely mobilized against us, right? Because that's how it works, right? That's how rights work, in a way. So, and that's a difficult problem to have, right? I don't think that's simple. I don't think that's a simple thing to say, and or a simple thing to even practice. But it's something we need to work on now. And in the context, however, of cynical deployments of trauma that are, you know, and the whole context in academia right now of very much of quote unquote viewpoint diversity, which is in many ways laboring under an idea that the right has been marginalized, you know. So that is all a complex constellation of issues that I'm thinking about. But, you know, absolutely, I really agree with that. And yeah, appreciate the points about Freud.
I think it's what I would call a necessary problem. Not just in an academic context, but in a wider democratic context.
Absolutely.
Because we do have political discussions outside academia as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I see it's 1:10, so
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time.